thank you again for coming to visit us on historical fiction, amazing new books coming soon. And this morning, I am privileged to introduce you to Siddiqua Johnson, who wrote The Yellow Wife that I just finished a couple weeks ago and loved. It blew me away. It was gorgeous. Thank you, Siddiqua, so much for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's so awesome to be here with you.
I'm so glad you could be here. And some of my readers on this page have already read the book, and they said they couldn't wait to listen to this today. So this will be fun. So I'm going to read to you about Siddiqua's bio and then a little synopsis of Yellow Wife, and then she's going to read to us. So sit back with your tea or coffee. If you're like me, a little coffee and Bailey's, just sit back and relax. And
you know how to get the party started.
Yeah, if you're not having fun, why bother, right? So I'm just... All right, let's get to it. So Siddiqua Johnson is the award-winning author of 4 novels. Her accolades include the National Book Club Award, the Phyllis Wheatley Book Award, and the USA Best Book Award for Best Fiction. She is a Conbilio Fellow. Is that how I pronounce it? Conbilio? Mm-hmm. Former board member of the James River Writers and a tall poppy writer. Originally from Philadelphia, she currently lives near Richmond, Virginia with her husband and 3 children where she's keeping warm right now. And I am not. Yellow Wife. This harrowing story follows an enslaved woman forced to barter love and freedom while living in the most infamous slave jail in Virginia. Born on a plantation in Charles City, Virginia, Pheby Delores Brown has lived a privileged life, shielded by her mother's position as the plantation's medicine woman and cherished by the master's sister. She's set apart from the others on the plantation, belonging to neither world. Freedom on her 18th birthday has been promised to her, but instead of the idyllic life she imagined with her true love, Essex Henry, Pheby is forced to leave the only home she's ever known and unexpectedly finds herself thrust into the bowels of slavery at the infamous Devil's Half-Acre, a jail where the enslaved are broken, tortured, and sold every day in Richmond, Virginia. There, Phebe is exposed not just to her jailer's cruelty, but also to his contradictions. To survive, Phebe will have to outwit him, but soon faces the ultimate sacrifice. And that was an incredible book to read. It's so many books, especially historical fiction books, are so hard to read, but so necessary to read. And I'm going to ask you lots about it after. But okay. We're going to sit back and let you read now and not listen to me anymore. So thank you very much and take it away.
Awesome. Well, that was a great introduction. So thank you for that. So I'm just going to start right at the beginning of the book. Part 1, Bell Plantation, Charles City, Virginia, 1850. Mama believed that the full moon was the most fertile night of the month, and that everything she touched held God's power. Each full moon, she dragged me out in the middle of the night with her to hunt for roots, plants, seedlings, and rare blossoms to use for healing. I did not understand why God's power could not be found during daylight hours, and as I trudged behind her, the March cold overwhelmed me. Even my thick wool shawl was no match against the country freeze. Fear of the woods made my feet clumsy, and I tripped over fallen sticks, scratched my shin on the spiky brush, and bumped my head on low-hanging branches. Mama, on the other hand, moved with skill and confidence, like the earth parted a path and presented the way for her. Even in the dark, she knew where to stop for herbs and how to avoid the dangerous ones. We had only a small lantern to guide us, and when I asked how she knew where things grew, she responded, "My gut be my light." We slipped through the thicket, past the drafty cabins where the field hands slept on pallets stuffed with hay and husk. I heard dry coughs and a low whine from a hungry baby. Further down toward the James River, we traveled through the clearing where we met on Sundays for church. Then over the hill, along the side of the cemetery, peppered with sticks to honor our dead. As we traveled deeper into the woods of the plantation, the thick forest blocked the light of the moon. I could hear the growls and grunts of unseen animals and fretted over running into hungry raccoons or red foxes or stepping on a poisonous snake. I tried to clear the worry from my mind as the land flattened out, but then something pricked my ankle. Before I could call out, Mama stopped suddenly and reached for my hand. This here is a black walnut tree. Grow deep in the woods, so you gotta know where to look. Cure for most everything. Ever unsure, come seek this tree. Mama handed me the lantern, then pulled a blade from her satchel and severed a piece of bark. She brought it to her nose, then ran her tongue along the inside of it. Huss stain anything it touch. After we make a tea for Rachel, rest we use to dye those sheets for the nursery. Just hoping we ain't too late to save that girl. Mama reached into her bag and pulled out a red ribbon. Go on and mark it, so it'll be easy to find when you come without me. I reached up and tied the ribbon on a skinny twig, knowing I had no intention of roaming these woods without my mama. We stopped at the sick house on our way back home. That morning, Rachel, the house servant, had been moved from the big house to the sick room on account of a high fever. Even though Master Jacob's wife, Mrs. Delphina, knew Mama worked plants better than anybody, she refused to bring her up to the house to tend to Rachel when she got fevered with lockjaw. Rachel grew up on Mrs. Delphina's family plantation and came with her to Master Jacob's as a wedding gift from her mother. Since Mrs. Delphina looked down on Mama's medicine, she called in a white doctor for Rachel, which Mama said was a waste of good money. He ain't know nothing about doctoring no field hands. And Mama was right. Now that the white medicine had failed, Mrs. Delphina had no choice but to move Rachel to the sick house. When we entered the room, even I could look at Rachel's pale body and see death coming for her. You ready to hot water? Mama asked the sick nurse, who nodded her head and pointed to the boiling pot. Mama reached into her sack and pulled out the bark and leaves from the black walnut tree. Then she pinched off a sprig of snake root and crushed up the stems. Let it steep for about an hour, then make her sip every time she opened her eyes. If she make it through the night, there be hope. Mama removed a few balms and poultices from her medicine satchel for the other patients, then gently pressed Rachel's forehead with the palm of her hand and whispered, Lord, look on Rachel with eyes of mercy. Restore her to wholeness and strength. Thy will be done. A few hours later, Mama and I were snuggled in our cottony bed, draped in heavy linens, when we were awakened by the ringing of the plantation bell. Oh, Lord, what is it now? Mama kept her eyes on me. There was a cause for each chime of the bell, and on that morning, the bell rang twice. 2 rings meant that Master Jacob wanted to see us for an announcement on the side of the big house. I burrowed deeper into the blankets and mumbled, Hope it is not Rachel. Mama's face went slack. Come, Delores, needing to move directly. She always called me by my middle name, her way of claiming me as her own, I guess. The fire had died down in the middle of the night, so the cold bled right through my woolen socks as soon as they hit the floor. Mama tied the back of her skirt while slipping into her leather shoes. Even in haste, she did not leave the house without oiling her molasses-colored skin with palm oil and pinning her thick hair just right. I fumbled around in the cupboards, but could not produce my headscarf. Mama cut her eyes up at me as she descended the ladder, so I moved on without it. I followed, barely awake in the pre-dawn cold, up the bluff to the big house. Even at first light, I could smell onions and garlic and butter wafting up from the kitchen house. Mama strode several paces in front of me, and I almost tripped over my own feet trying to catch her. A rustling of leaves sprang from the woods, and then out of the thicket came a long procession of scantily dressed field hands. Mothers had babies tied to their backs. Old people leaned on makeshift canes, and strong men carried little children on their shoulders. I fell in step with Mama as we rounded the side of the house, hoping to catch sight of Essex coming out of the stables. Just a glance from him could change up my whole day. As I scanned the crowd, Mama squeezed my hand and pulled me up front where we, as seamstress, belong. Aunt Hope, the plantation cook, stood nearest to the steps, and next to her was Lovey, the keeper of the house. Next to Lovey was Parrot, butler, driver, and manservant to Master Jacob. Women and children of the field stood behind them. The men always had to stand furthest back from the house. Snitch, the plantation overseer, stood to the side of us with a cowhide whip around his neck and his bloodshot eyes watching all of us. When I got still, a warm breath broke across the back of my neck. Only Essex would be so bold, and I reached my left hand back and grazed his fingertips. It had been days since we touched, and I pulled away quickly as little shock waves surged across my belly. Mrs. Delphina appeared on the side porch with a black scarf draped over her shoulders. Before I could wonder after Master Jacob, he came through the door wearing a flared frock coat with a high stand-up collar. He drew himself up to his full 6-foot height, and the sun caught the honey streaks in his eyes as he looked down on us. I watched his Adam's apple bob around in his neck as he spoke, a habit that helped me avoid looking him in the eye when other people were around. It pains me to announce that our sweet servant Rachel has gone to be with her Maker. May she rest in peace. Mrs. Delphina leaned into his solid mass as if he was a pillar, and without his strength, she would faint. The crowd gasped, and a few called on Jesus, but Mama just sucked air through her 2 front teeth. Not loud, but I heard, and knew that it meant Mrs. was a fool for not calling on her sooner. Keep us in your prayers as you return to work. Sounds of compliance stirred through the crowd as the field hands started back down the hill, taking with them the smell of wet soil and manure. Master grabbed 2 women and instructed them to take care of Rachel's body. Then he looked over at me. Phebe, need you up at the house now that Rachel is gone. Phebe? Mrs. Delphina smacked her lips like she had been fed something sour. I have her sewing sheets for the nursery. She fares better in the loom house. The girl knows her way around and can fill in just fine. Master Jacob pulled her close, smothering away any fight. I looked down at my feet. On the few occasions I'd helped in the big house, the strenuous work had been taxing enough. Now, to be holed up with Mrs. Delphina while she mourned her dearest Rachel would be like having a noose around my neck. My heart started to throb as I climbed the steps. Then, from the corner of my eye, I found Essex brazenly staring at me. He was leaning against the silver birch tree, a piece of straw hanging from the side of his mouth. He brushed his nose twice, which was code for meet me in the stables after dark. I scratched my ear as an answer. I will try. Then put an extra drop in my hips as I pushed open the side of the house. The entrance led into a small prep area just before the dining room. I started hatching a plan on how to get out tonight with anyone asking too many questions when, out of nowhere, a heavy slap landed across my face. My sight went blurry. When I refocused, Mrs. Delphina flared her nostrils at me. Do not come in here running amok. You better take heed or you will find yourself in the fields. Yes, missus. It took full concentration not to touch the spot she had slapped. I refused to give her the satisfaction of knowing how much she had hurt me. And where is your scarf? Think you too pretty to tie up that hair? She flicked my pinned-up hair and knocked it free. Waves of soft spirals flowed down past my shoulders. Mrs. eyed me like she wanted to slap me again, and I hurried to twirl my hair back up and tucked it away. Her mouth turned down and rested in her perpetual frown. Mrs. Delphina was more handsome than pretty, a box-shaped woman with big, broad shoulders and startling green eyes that could cut through skin. She tended to favor the color brown, though it made her look much older than her 24 years. I thought she would look pretty in a shade of peach or plum. Lovey, she called to the woman who was in charge at the house, see that this girl looks proper and get her started cleaning the bedrooms. Yes, Mrs. Lovey curtsied, and I forced my knees to do the same.
Wow. Thank you. That was great. Gives you a really nice Nice intro. What's going to happen with Phoebe? Quite a disturbing story. I have to say, I mean, you read stories about slavery and all that, but you were right there. I watched the video of you going to see the prison. Can you tell us about all that? How that came together?
So I'll back up to like just first discovering the story.
Yeah.
It was April of 2016. And we had some friends. We had just moved to the Richmond area in 2015. So we hadn't been here that long and hadn't done the real touristy get to know Richmond thing. So when friends came to visit, it was a good excuse. So we dragged them down to the Richmond Slave Trail, which runs along the James River. There's 17 markers along the way, and it basically tells the story. It tells the journey of the enslaved people as they came into Richmond. Richmond was number 2 behind New Orleans in slave trading and the profit that they shared from it. So it was a big hub here. So as we walked along the river, the children took turns reading the different markers. And when we got to the marker that talked about the Lumpkins jail, it was like everything in my body just started to pay attention. It said that the Lumpkins jail was a punishing center for over 200,000 slaves between 1844 and 1865. And that the owner, his name was Robert Lumpkin, was referred to as the bully trader because he was a man who was notoriously known for being evil and conniving and punishing the slaves and treating them, like pieces of furniture. But the contradiction was it said that he was married to a Black woman and her name was Mary Lumpkins, and they had 5 children together. So my first thought was, wait, interracial relationships in 1850 in Virginia was illegal. So how did that work out? Was it a marriage of sacrifice? Was it a marriage of survival? Could she have loved him? So that was the first thing that I wanted to know. And then the second part was, what was it like for Mary Lumpkin living on a half-acre with this man who wore 2 faces and raising these 5 children, where her fellow slaves were constantly being punished and dying and their families were being separated. I mean, a half-acre of land is not a big piece of property for this jail and the tavern and the house that she raised them in. And so I couldn't stop wondering what it was like for them. And that was really the beginning of the story kind of grabbing hold of my skin. We skipped ahead on the trail. The kids got tired of walking. The whole trail is about 4.5 miles. So we got back in the car and we skipped to the end of the trail, which was the site of the Lumpkins jail. And we were in the parking lot and we were reading more about it. And I just started to feel this energy. Right to the side of it, to the right of the parking lot, is the African sacred burial ground. And so when the enslaved people died at the jail, there was no ceremony for them. They literally waited for the bodies to pile up and then they just dumped them in the ground. So that portion is a sacred space in Richmond. And we could feel this energy between the site of the jail and the African burial ground. There was this energy that we could feel. It was like the ancestors were there. They were sending us messages. My friend pretended to play the African drums. The kids started dancing. We were all just kind of moving and like accepting the energy. And it was like, oh my gosh, they had been waiting for us. And then as a writer, I thought, wait a minute, they were waiting for me. They want me to tell their story. So I had that feeling. I get back in my car. I go home. For the next couple of days, I'm just Googling information. It won't let me go. Now, I have not written a word of historical fiction before. My previous first 3 novels were all contemporary fiction, but I love reading stories, that took place in the past. So I had read like Jubilee by Margaret Walker when I was in high school. So these stories were ones that I identified with, but didn't think I was qualified. Like I thought it was a separate skill or something that you needed, So I'm just Googling information and I'm getting it all together. And I have a friend who comes over and she says, "What are you working on next?" And I was telling her about the story and I'm like, but I don't know. I'm so afraid of it. I don't know if this is, if I could do this. And she says, "Siddiqua, the thing that scares you the most is what you're supposed to be doing next." And that just kind of opened the window. It cracked a little breeze that said, okay, just give it a try.
Oh, well, we owe her a thank you. This was gorgeous. I was going to ask you about that because in the video you said that you went there and you showed um, the map of the place. So was the building still there, or was just a space like a memorial area?
Where the Lumpkins jail, where
Yeah.
all the outbuildings is just a space right now. I think at some point Richmond wants to build it back up and make it a museum. They've been talking about it for a few years, but right now it's literally just a parking lot with a picture and with the
Yeah.
map. Yeah.
Yeah, I wondered what it would feel like to be there, and you answered that beautifully. Because when you can hear the voices and feel that energy, there's a lot of things you can write about in historical fiction, but when it hooks you like that, you can't get away from it. So I'm really glad that you took this big leap. Was that what was it like? Because I don't think it's like a whole different set of requirements or skills or anything. It just means you have to dig and do a lot of digging. But that's for me the most fun of it is the research of it. I'd never written anything before I started writing this stuff. So, but I'd love to know what it felt like writing the characters in this, characters from centuries ago, to writing the contemporary romances that you're used to writing. That must have been a big shift.
Yeah, the research was copious. I mean, it was so robust. It was so much information. I would say researching it was probably just as fun to me as actually writing the story. I did a combination of going to plantations. I tried to focus specifically on Virginia because slavery in Virginia is going to be different than slavery in Maryland and New Orleans. And so it was important for me to kind of narrow my scope. So we did plantation visits. Luckily, I don't live far from the Library of Virginia, which had a lot of newspaper articles about the 1850s and about what slavery was like in Richmond. I read a lot of books and historical books, but I think when you said earlier how you just felt like you were brought into the story, it was because I read a lot of books by enslaved people. I read slave narratives because for me, it was really important not to have that film between the reader and the text. I wanted them to be up close and personal.
Yes.
Um, so by reading those narratives, I was able to get their language. I was able to get into their head. I was able to get the feel for what it was like for them on a daily basis so that I could do them justice in the story.
Oh, that kind of stuff, the newspapers and the journals, that's just gold when you're researching. That's wonderful. But it would have been a very difficult personal thing for you as well. When I wrote about the home children that were up here, it was so emotional for me, and it was so hard to keep my thoughts separate from the actual, my emotions apart from what it was. That must have been hard for you to separate your actual personal feelings from what you were learning, and that must have been really difficult.
It was difficult moments, because it's like, these are our ancestors. These are people who have gone through the most unimaginable circumstances that you can imagine. And some of the stories that I came across were gutting, they were heart-wrenching. But it
Yeah.
was also important for me to stay true to that because it happened. And it was important for me to get that down on the page because it was a way of honoring them and honoring their sacrifices and honoring what they have been through. For me to be here, to be able to move about and write books, it's because of them and their sacrifices.
Did it stick with you for a long time, that feeling of them?
It did. I started working on a new book. I don't know. It's hard to, I don't know if it's like this for you, but it's hard to say when I started on the new book because like you have the idea and then you write the book. So it's like, it's in your head, but the actual mechanics of doing it is not the same time period.
Yeah.
So as I was transitioning to the newer book, I kept thinking Phoebe. Even like 2 days ago, I went to write and I wrote Phoebe's name. I'm like, wait, this is not Phoebe's story anymore. So it's like they're still kind of hanging out. And then all the conversations I'm having with readers, they're like, well, what happened with this and what happened with that? So it brings everything back up again. So
So,
they're
now,
they're live.
yeah. So now, I have to ask if you're talking about your next book. Are you going to stick with historical fiction? Are you going to do romance? What are you going to do next?
So I'm sticking with historical fiction. I had to bring it up a few generations because I needed a little bit of a break. It was tough to stay, in such a difficult part of American history for
Yeah.
3 years. I worked on that book for about 3 years. So I'm bringing up the next novel to 1950s. So it's still historical. It's the 1950s. It's a cross between Philadelphia and DC. Two strong women who have sacrificial things that happen to them and choices that they have to make. I love writing about strong women who have to walk through the fire and what it's like when they get to the other side. And so same theme, you know, as all my other books, even though Yellow Wife is historical fiction and my previous three novels are contemporary fiction, I would say the same theme runs throughout. It's always about love. It's always about sacrifice. It's always about family. It's always about choices that people have to make and what it's like when they get to the other side.
Yeah, and I've been working on a workshop. I'm doing a workshop in the spring, and I was trying to think it's how to write historical fiction, and it's a hard thing to teach because I don't know. I just kind of do it. But what I was thinking when you said that was, I said there's two things that make up historical fiction, and the first one is that it's a story. That's, to me, that's the most important part, that we are writing a story, and then the second part is that it happens to have happened in the past. So it's still going to be a story. It's got to be something that you connect people to. And my feeling on historical fiction is that if you don't connect the characters to the readers, then they're not going to remember the history. You know, it has to really, really be part of them. And you sure did that. All of them, all of the characters in your book they were so beautifully filled out, so full of life. So I want to thank you for that. It was a beautiful read.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to get back to, I'm going to read this again, actually, and then I'm going to wait for your next one, because I'm really glad you're going to be doing another historical fiction. I read all different genres, but historical fiction has always had my heart. And so I'm glad to put you in there in my bookshelf with my other favorites.
Awesome. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much for coming on here with me and saying hello to everybody.
Thank you so much for having me. Hello to your audience. I hope you guys enjoy Yellow Wife. If you want to find me, you can reach me on Instagram. My IG handle is Siddiqua Says. Twitter, Siddiqua Says. You can like my page on Facebook, and also you can go to my website, which is siddiquajohnson.net.
Perfect. And I will have all of the buy links, all the links to where people can purchase your book right on with this video. So just click on those and definitely go get yourself a copy of this, because you know that you're going to love it if I loved it. So there you go. Thank you again, Siddiqua, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Awesome. You too, Genevieve.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.